So the topic today, does Monoecious Hydrilla pose a significant threat to northern waters? I believe the answer is yes, but I want to reinforce why we believe that. And within the Corps, we're always asked to come up with a problem statement, and I thought I'd be really concise with my problem statement and say, you know, hydrilla is a full-time weed and we're part-time researchers, and there's a lot of things about Monoecious Hydrilla that we're just beginning to understand that I think basically have really opened my eyes to what it means, you know, to have Monoecious Hydrilla moving northward. So if we think of hydrilla, it's been called the almost perfect weed. And just a second. Okay, this is a message from Troy. But it's been called the almost perfect weed, and you know, we've always thought of it as the ability to cover thousands of contiguous acres, which we've observed in multiple states. Propagates by fragments, turions, tubers, crowns, and those tubers can remain quiescent for years, and you know, and that's kind of that seed bank idea of this plant. From a growth standpoint, has very low light and carbon dioxide compensation points, which really gives it an advantage in a lot of environments in terms of just rapid growth. And it is those high growth rates that really tend to make this highly invasive. When I've given this talk in the past, I've never really said much about biotypes. And I think in my mind what's becoming more and more clear to me is that the biotype issue with hydrilla really matters, and that's basically what the rest of my talk is going to be about. So if we think of the background of hydrilla in the U.S., there's been two separate introductions, one being the Monoecious lineage that you're dealing with in New York. And, you know, we've known for years that this seems to be adapted to northern latitudes, but we've never really asked why. You know, we just said, well, it is, and we thought it was pretty much confined to the mid-Atlantic states. It wasn't going to move further north, and didn't really ask why. And the Dioecious lineage, basically, we've seen as a southern strain. What I will say about both of them is they're both polyploids. They're both exhibit heterosis, or kind of that hybrid vigor growth. And I think the reason that's important is that if you look in worldwide literature, there's a lot of biotypes of hydrilla that are very, you know, kind of would be considered kind of non-aggressive, or, you know, we have folks in some parts of the world trying to preserve hydrilla because it's considered, you know, a valuable plant to them. And you know, so I do want you to understand that the two hydrilla biotypes that we have in the U.S. tend to be very aggressive, and you know, both being polyploids, which allows them to, you know, to be invasive in a lot of environments. So if we think of the Dioecious Hydrilla, the strain that's in the south, you know, this has been introduced since the 1950s. It's been in Florida since the 1950s. You know, pretty well known because it jumps to the surface, forms canopies very rapidly, persists in warm water. So in Florida, we'll see Dioecious Hydrilla year-round. Tubers are produced in the late fall, though. I mean, that is the one big distinction between the two biotypes, is that our tubers don't really start get going until basically the short days occur after September 21st. The other thing is that they show asynchronous sprouting, and what this means is that they'll sprout basically any time of year, and there really is no season for sprouting in the south. And one of the things that we've seen with this, why this is important, is that when we have warm, dry springs in the south, we can really see that very extensive early growth, and that's all coming back from vegetative growth. But if we have a cold, wet spring or a cold winter where most of the vegetation gets knocked back, it can really set the plant back significantly. And, you know, the question became, why has this not shown potential for northern spread? And I think the reason for that is it goes back to the basic biology of the plant. The fact that it can't form tubers until later in the season, if you think of you know, a site like New York, by September 21st, your waters are rapidly cooling, and it does impact the ability of the plant to translocate carbohydrates and move them into tubers. So I believe that's one of the reasons we've never seen this strain move north, or move north. Now, just kind of as an aside and for some perspective, is that we're still doing a lot of large-scale hydrilla treatments in Florida, and if you look at the dates on these, you know, this is from 2013. We did it in November of 2013. The large-scale treatments at this site are going out this week at this same site. And the thing I want to impress on you is that once you get it bad like this, you know, we're out managing on a nearly yearly basis in some of these areas. And, you know, 1,000 acres, or what is it, 750 acres at a time gets quite expensive. So the idea, well, let's let it spread and see how bad it'll get, I think is really, Florida could tell you that's probably a pretty bad idea. Now, as we move into the Monoecious Hydrilla, northern distribution in the U.S., it was not introduced until the 1970s, and I think that's important to understand, is that we've had dioecious here for really a full 20, 25 years longer. This plant tends to spread a little bit differently in that it's slower to form a surface canopy because it spreads laterally first and then grows to the surface. And it does die back fully in the winter. We're not aware of any populations that are persisting year-round, even in the southern states. But I think, again, one of the big differences here, and something that we can take advantage of as managers, is that we think that there is synchronous tuber sprouting in the late spring, especially in northern states. So you have the tubers that form not, on September 21st or starting on September 21st, like the dioecious strain. In the case of Monoecious, they're formed in the summer into the fall. And one of the implications of all this is that when we have warm, dry spring events, it's really not relevant to this plant, nor is a cold, wet spring or a particularly cold winter. That those tubers are basically sitting down there, they're waiting to sprout, and they're not going to sprout. It's going to be a synchronous event and somewhat dependent on latitude, and I'll get into that in just a little bit. But basically, after those things sprout, you see a mass sprouting, and that's when the rapid growth curves take over. Now, if we think of spread of Monoecious Hydrilla, again, first found in Delaware in the 70s. But what I want you to notice is the bottom line, where we're now finding it in 22 states, whereas with the dioecious biotype that's been here much longer, it's found in only 14 states. The other thing that's of real interest to me is it's not only moving north, it's moving south, and really getting into some of our big reservoir systems where we said, gee, it won't be a problem here, and it turns out that it's a problem in those sites as well. So, there's been a fair amount of focus on Monoecious Hydrilla in New York. I'm working on with the Buffalo District on a large-scale demonstration project, in conjunction with several other agencies, including the DEC and Fish and Wildlife Service and EPA. And this was the first year, this past year was really the first year of our large-scale demo. And I'm not going to really talk about these projects in particular, mainly due to time. But, the big question to me was, does the biotype pose a significant threat to northern waters? And that still, to me, is the overarching question, is that, yes, we think it does, but we need to know more about it so we can truly assess the risk and which water bodies are at greatest risk. And, we do have right now a risk assessment funded specifically for Monoecious Hydrilla, and I think that's a really big step forward. Now, again, why do we worry about small infestations like on Lake Cayuga, the inlet in Lake Cayuga? It was a very small infestation. I mean, that should be self-evident to anybody working in this field. It's just that ability to spread from there into multiple other sites of value. It doesn't mean that hydrilla is going to be a problem at every site, but, as you start moving it around, it's very likely going to find some sites that are very suitable to it. I would like to make mention of the Cayuga project overall. I'm on the technical review committee for that, but to me that thing has been run extremely well, and the way they get the information out and report to people, I think it's just been a real model for how we should be doing things. And again, if you think of the demonstration project in the Erie Canal, why are we so worried about patches of hydrilla along a 7 to 10 mile stretch of the canal? And again, it just goes back to look at all the resources around there that, where we could move hydrilla, and we don't know how it will perform in these types of systems. So if I was to sum it all up and to say, why are we concerned about hydrilla in the Midwest and Northeast? And I do quite a bit of work in the upper Midwest. And what I would say to that, to anybody, is that, you think about it and you look around, there's no analog in the world to the thousands of natural lakes that we have in this region, and specifically these lakes tend to support vegetation, native submerged vegetation. There's typically a lot of human utilization and value placed on these lakes, and we have a well-established aquatic plant management industry that is going to put pressure on resource managers to do something. And kind of lastly, there's a really strong disincentive for use of grass carp. and I'll talk about why this is important in a little bit. But you know, I just don't ever see us going to whole-scale grass carp in the northern tier states. And the question becomes, do you want to add hydrilla to this mix? Now, we've been asking this question for a while. Mike Greer from the Buffalo District and I put out a white paper basically looking to establish research and management priorities for Monoecious Hydrilla. And, you know, in that paper, we, you know, in the bold down there, we said, will Monoecious Hydrilla be a serious invader in this region, or will the level of threat not live up to current predictions? You know, the timely answer to this question is of paramount importance to resource managers, policymakers, and stakeholders. And the one reason I'd say, I'm really proud of this report, you know, that it's dated January 2014. We started in 2012 really on this, is that we started along this line of saying, man, we need more research on this plant, and we've really seen people come through in terms of providing some support so that we can look at this plant in greater depth and start answering some of those questions revolving around risk assessment. So if I was to say, you know, what are some of the research objectives that we've looked at? And certainly number one is to improve our knowledge on the biology of the plant. Very limited information compared to the dioecious biotype. So in a sense, we've been making a lot of assumptions about Monoecious Hydrilla based on biology information from dioecious. In some cases, this is probably right, and in other cases, it could really, you know, move us in the wrong direction. We want to use this information to improve management strategies. You know, the reservoirs and lakes really tend to be different. Rivers, you know, are a significant challenge due to flow, you know, in terms of current management strategies. And certainly want to use this information to predict the systems that are of greatest risk. So our current hypotheses, and I just wanted to run a few of these by you to show you some of the work that's ongoing in terms of our knowledge of Monoecious Hydrilla, is that, you know, one of the hypotheses is that the tuber sprouting is highly synchronous in northern latitudes. And I can't stress enough why this is important, because it is totally asynchronous in a place like Florida. So we can't treat based on tuber biology or phenology and say that, you know, gee, we treated at a point when the plant was at a weak point in its life cycle. With Monoecious, I think we can. And we think it's driven largely by the fact that, you know, it's exposed to colder temperatures. And I'll try to explain why this matters to you. Monoecious is a reservoir disturbance specialist, and we're beginning to see more and more sites where it's showing up that would suggest that it's really successful in some of these highly disturbed areas. That's where it's going to get a foothold. It doesn't mean that it needs a disturbed area to be successful. It just means that it's really good at getting established in those areas. And lastly, the one I wanted to take on was hydrilla does not thrive in cold water. And, you know, there's a difference to me between a cold environment and cold water, and I'll explain that in a little bit. So first of all, if we look at temporal impacts on growth, and so we did a study where we looked at hydrilla growth at 35-day intervals on a yearly basis. And we did this in Florida, and yes, we do get cool in Florida, but not, you know, not anything like you're getting. But what we wanted to look at is, you know, if this plant really is good at thriving in cooler waters, we should see some evidence of that in terms of its growth pattern in a place like Florida. So we planted hydrilla every other week for an entire year, and then looked at basically, you know, shoot mass, tuber production, all of those things, and said, you know, what does growth look like in Florida? And what I can tell you with Monoecious Hydrilla, growth looks like in Florida what it will look like in New York. You're not going to see a lot of growth until those summer months, and then it becomes highly explosive. So we see extremely poor growth. I mean, the plants survive, but there's just no growth in those colder water temperatures. We augmented light to kind of answer the question of whether photoperiod was really dominating or playing a role. And while it played a minor role, I would say it certainly temperature was driving growth in this case. So, you know, one way to look at this is if we were to look at you know, reaching carrying capacity. That's one way I tend to look at things. So if we plant 3 shoots in 12 pots in one of our tanks, basically that comes down to, if you did the math, it comes down to about 2 tubers per square foot. And what I wanted to get across to you from this is that a very small number of sprouted tubers can create significant biomass. And I think in a lot of these projects we tend to look at tuber numbers as you know, success, and I think it is success, but we just have to be careful that even when we get down to really low numbers, just because of the growth rate of this plant, it doesn't take many propagules sprouting to fill in a given area very rapidly. And I think it's very important to understand is that just a few propagules can, because of high growth rates, can fill in that area very quickly. So what are the growth trials telling us? I'd say the first thing is it's not cold tolerant. It's not going to grow in cold water at all. The growth occurs in short bursts when the water temperatures and day lengths are favorable. And one way to think of this is like Vallisneria, which does the same thing. Early sprouting tubers are not likely to create problematic growth. And I think that's important as we move forward in terms of management strategies to understand that if you have 1 million tubers per acre, you might see a few sprout early in the season. But I still would contend that those are not the ones you need to be concerned with. You need to be concerned when that sprouting peak reaches a maximum, and that's when management should really be considered. The Monoecious Hydrilla is well suited to northern climate, largely because of life history advantages. It's just basically it grows when the water warms up, and from a reservoir standpoint when it clears up. So it's going to grow as rapidly as it can when those two conditions occur. Now, what is the potential influence of latitude on synchronous sprouting? And we looked at in situ tuber sprouting, and we quantified the following. We looked at dioecious tubers that were formed in 2013 through 2014 and monoecious tubers that were formed in 2013. And we left one cohort of these plants in our tanks in ambient conditions and then followed sprouting through the next year. With another cohort, we moved them into a refrigerated conditions, or 4C, which you're likely to see in New York, basically, for long periods of time. And we did this for 1, 2, or 3 months. And these were in situ, so these were pots that contained hydrilla tubers, and they were moved back and forth or left under ambient conditions. And when we look at the in situ tuber sprouting from April to September, what we see is, with plants that were left in ambient conditions in Florida, there's almost no response. So Monoecious Hydrilla showed it basically was asynchronous, just like Dioecious Hydrilla. But when we gave it that cold period, all of a sudden you see those tubers sprouting really right around the month of June really increase very rapidly. And I think that's one of the things that we're observing in these northern climates is that we do have a potential weak point in the life cycle in terms of really being able to get high tuber sprouting rates, basically just based on the fact that the tubers were exposed to cold winters. Now I've got that little indication on there, that false signature in July, and that's because if we see 75, 85, 95% sprouting in June, basically we're just seeing those same sprouts in July. So it's not like it's continuing to sprout in July. We see a real strong peak and then a decline. So how does that look in the real world? Well, if we were to take our Erie Canal data from this year, and we did very extensive tuber sampling to document treatment impacts there, our June average of sprouting was 91%. So 91% sprouting, the year of treatment would indicate that 91% of that propagule bank is being spent if we can find a way to kill those plants before they make new tubers. Now again, in July we saw 82% sprouting, but again, that's just an artifact of what happened in early June. And by August we had 0%. I think that's really important to understand, is that we're not seeing late sprouting occur with a plant like Hydrilla, at least in this side of New York. So if we can get those plants after they've sprouted and before they form new tubers, you really can wear that tuber bank down. So how might that look? And this is more of a theoretical graph, but in a place like New York, I think you're going to see this really high sprouting event in mid to late June, followed by, you might have some stragglers sprout later, but we've done 2 years of this now in the Erie Canal, and we've not seen any tuber sprouting, basically in August and September, and I think that's really encouraging to understand that. Now, I told you earlier, Monoecious Hydrilla, we view it as a reservoir disturbance specialist. And I think the main reason we have that hypothesis right now is that that's where we're finding it so much, is in these highly fluctuating reservoirs, and especially in the southeast. And, if you think of what's going on there, you have high energy, huge water level fluctuations, in a lot of cases very high turbidity. But what we think is happening is the tuber sprouting and growth is synchronized with favorable conditions. So by the summertime, you have much lower flows typically, the water clears up, and boom, the hydrilla takes off. And so it probably is adapted pretty well to drawdowns, but in some level it's just adapted to disturbance really well. And so the big question becomes, why don't we hear more about it? And I would say, at least in the mid-Atlantic states, is just heavy use of grass carp. I mean, I think we would be hearing all kinds of stories about hydrilla if there weren't so many grass carp stocked in those reservoirs. And they don't really have natural lakes. So as we move hydrilla north into a system where you're more in natural lake environments, A, I don't think you're going to use grass carp, and B, we're going to kind of test that does hydrilla really require a disturbed environment, or is it just going to move into these lakes and really start taking over? And a good example of this to me is that we have hydrilla coming into the TVA system, where you have the monoecious biotype basically taking over the dioecious biotype in a system that's pretty minimally managed. And when I say taking over, they have, I was just at a meeting there in November. They have about 25,000 acres now of hydrilla, mixed of the two biotypes. And over time, it's what we're seeing is we think it's pretty likely the monoecious type is going to probably win out. Kind of a couple of other things about hydrilla, we're seeing it show up in odd places. There's a lot of places we just would have never predicted that it would be growing, and it's growing in these wild and scenic rivers. And that has some real implications, especially to unique macroinvertebrate and fish communities that rely on open spaces, and you got hydrilla growing in every nook and cranny in those. Some unintended consequences, and I think this will largely stay in the South, but I just wanted to bring this up because it is one of those situations where it's an unintended consequence. Hydrilla and J. Strom-Thurmond Reservoir, where you have an epiphytic algae that's attached to hydrilla. It produces a novel toxin. Coots consume it. They become neurologically impaired, and then eagles feed on those coots, and they become neurologically impaired and eventually die. And, that's a really big issue in the South, but it's just one of those situations where, we kind of let hydrilla come into the reservoir. It really took over, and now we're dealing with a wholly unexpected and unintended consequence of letting an invasive take over in that situation. So research for 2015, a couple of things that I think you're going to start seeing is that we're starting to get more papers out on Monoecious Hydrilla. So I think that's one of the trends that you're going to see. We've established collaborative work with multiple researchers around the country, with the ARS in Davis, California. And then with the risk assessment, one of the aspects of the risk assessment is we were able to get a research facility established in the North Carolina mountains. And why that's important is those conditions there will actually simulate New York pretty well. And that's always been one of the real struggles with trying to simulate what's going on with Monoecious Hydrilla in the north, because nobody wants to let you research with it up there and grow it up there. So I am encouraged by that. Our operations for 2015, ongoing demonstration on the Erie Canal, that will keep on going. Cayuga, like I said, is a fabulous project in terms of what they've been able to do and how they communicate. I put Deer Lake, Maryland. I did that in a hurry, and it's actually Deep Creek Lake, where that's a potable water reservoir, and they're doing some hydrilla management there, and that might be, of interest to people that, may have to do that for potable water sites. We're going to see increased interaction on southern reservoirs, and this is not something we planned on, but we're just seeing more and more Monoecious Hydrilla move into these southern reservoirs. And then obviously the Croton and Hudson River in New York, and kind of what's going on there. I think this was the first year you probably got a handle on maybe what you have, and I'm sure some of the discussions will lean towards, what needs to be done in the future. So to wrap it up, what are the benefits of all this work? Certainly hydrilla is our only national weed right now, and the reason I say that is it's really the only plant that kind of grows from shore to shore and north to south. Everything else tends to be a lot more regional. And so we have, both northern lakes and southern reservoirs at risk, and the research will benefit all resource managers, not just a specific group in a specific area. The cost of individual management projects can be significant and long-term, and Cayuga and the Erie Canal shows us that those are small projects, and yet they're fairly costly, and that's one of the reasons you don't want this stuff spread all over. And again, we're not likely to use grass carp in the north. And then this issue of spread of AVM, it's related to the spread of hydrilla, and we're seeing it not just in J. Strom-Thurmond now, but in several other reservoirs in Georgia and other sites there. And with that, I certainly acknowledge, the groups I work with, and be happy to take any questions if there's any.